October 18th, 1896. Henry Aldrich wasn't thinking about monsters when he climbed out of the Springfield carriage that morning. He was thinking about a story. The newspaper editor had been chasing rumors for 6 months. Letters from people claiming their children had vanished into an orphanage in the remote Ozark settlement called Shepherd Flats. Not runaway letters. Not letters saying the children had been transferred. Letters saying the children had gone into the compound and simply disappeared. Records became vague. Communications ceased. Inquiries were deflected. Aldrich was 41 years old. He'd built his reputation on the kind of journalism that made people uncomfortable, the kind that asked questions no one else wanted to ask. He'd sent word to his colleagues, "If I'm not back in a week, send help." He meant it as a joke. The Ozarks weren't that dangerous. An orphanage wasn't a crime scene. He was wrong on both counts. What Aldrich walked into at Shepherd Flats would make him disappear for 73 days. And what his disappearance would unleash would reshape how America protected its most vulnerable children. But first, we need to understand who was waiting for him in that compound, and what they'd been doing in the darkness beneath the floorboards. Comment your city below so we know where this dark history is reaching. Subscribe, because the truths that disappear don't always stay buried. Let's begin where the evil began. Mercy Caldwell was 47 years old when she built her orphanage. But to understand Mercy, we have to step back further. Back to a man named Tobias Patterson, her grandfather, and a theology so twisted it would take decades to infect an entire family lineage. Tobias was a circuit-riding preacher in Kentucky. In the 1830s, he developed an interpretation of Genesis that most mainstream theologians would have rejected out of hand. But Tobias wasn't trying to build consensus. He was building doctrine. His core belief, the bloodlines of Abraham's descendants carried divine essence. That essence could be diluted by mixing with inferior bloodlines, but it could also be recombined and strengthened through controlled, deliberate unions orchestrated by someone spiritually enlightened enough to see the pattern. This wasn't standard Christianity, and it wasn't incest in Tobias's twisted framework. It was what he called spiritual breeding, a sacred recombination of divine bloodlines. But here's the question that separates a preacher's personal heresy from an institutional crime. How do you implement a breeding program? How do you find the bloodlines worth combining? How do you force compliance from unwilling participants? Tobias never solved that problem. But his daughter, Mercy's mother, did. Mercy's mother, Eleanor Patterson, inherited her father's theology in the 1850s. But Eleanor added something crucial to the framework: a mechanism. She realized that orphaned children with no documented history, no family connections, no one looking for them, could be gathered into institutions. And if those institutions were isolated enough, controlled enough, that no external observer would see what was really happening inside them, those children could be kept. Eleanor died in 1879. She never built her institution, but she passed the theology and the blueprint to her daughter. Mercy Caldwell inherited both in 1883. Now we need to pause here and ask, was Mercy insane? Was she delusional? The answer is more complicated than we might want it to be. Mercy wasn't unable to distinguish reality. She was instead able to construct a theological framework so internally coherent that it justified atrocity. She wasn't seeing things that weren't there. She was choosing to see things that were there in a particular way. When she arrived at the isolated Ozark settlement and began acquiring land, she wasn't secretive about her intentions. She advertised in newspapers from St. Louis to Kansas City: Shepherd Flats Orphanage, compassionate Christian care for abandoned children. Inquire through postal correspondence. The advertisements were meticulous, professional. They presented Mercy as exactly what she claimed to be: a woman of means running a charitable institution. No red flags, no language that would suggest anything other than conventional orphanage work. But the children she selected were never conventional. Between 1883 and 1896, Mercy brought in 32 children under the guise of charity. But here's what made her selection process deliberately predatory. She chose only children between ages 8 and 14, all of them without documented family connections nearby. She chose children from distant settlements, from church charities that already had more children than resources, from urban relief boards that were desperate to place difficult cases. She chose children whose disappearance would raise no urgent questions, children whose erasure would be administratively convenient. So she built her compound, 3 log structures arranged around a central yard. On the surface, it looked like any other frontier orphanage. But beneath the surface, literally beneath the floorboards, she built something else. The cellar became her laboratory, but she didn't work alone. That's the key detail. Mercy was the architect of the theology. She was the administrator of the institution. But orchestrating 14 children, managing compliance, handling the logistics of a systematic breeding program, that required help. Her first assistant was a woman named Felinda Morse, age 34, who'd arrived at the compound in 1885 and never left. Felinda's background was equally isolated. No family, no prior employment record, no documented connections to any community. She was, in other words, the perfect employee for someone running a hidden institution, invisible enough that her departure would raise no questions. Felinda handled daily operations. She fed the children, she maintained records, and she administered what Mercy called the calming tea, a substance that would later be analyzed as a mixture of opium and chloral hydrate, a sedative cocktail designed to keep children compliant without rendering them unconscious. The children needed to be aware. They needed to understand what was happening. Mercy's journals would later reveal that this awareness was deliberate, that drugged compliance was preferable to unconscious passivity because the psychology of consent under duress was part of the spiritual program. But the real work, the biological succession, was handled by a man named Samuel Cross. Samuel was 41 years old, a laborer with no family, no community ties, and a willingness to do work that required a particular absence of conscience. Mercy had specifically recruited him, tracking down drifters, men without institutional anchors, men who could be convinced that their participation in her program represented spiritual advancement. Samuel's role was precisely documented in what he maintained, a biological ledger. This wasn't a secret document hidden away. It was a systematic record, page after page of entries that tracked which children were paired, the dates of pairing, the duration of each pairing, any pregnancies resulting, the outcomes of those pregnancies. The ledger reads like the breeding records of a livestock operation, except the animals being tracked were 13-year-old girls. 3 live births resulted from Mercy's breeding program between 1887 and 1896. 3 infants. All 3 were dead within 18 months of birth. Why? This is where Mercy's theology encountered reality, and where her attempts to justify the horror became even more twisted. The 3 infants had died of genetic complications, consistent with consanguineous reproduction, the biological consequences of forcing children from closely related bloodlines into reproductive union. Mercy documented these deaths in her journal with clinical precision, but her interpretation was theological. Those children were spiritually incomplete. Their deaths represent the natural elimination of insufficiently refined essence. This is not failure. This is selection. She'd created a framework in which infant mortality resulting from incest became proof that her theology was working, that the universe itself was rejecting spiritually insufficient offspring. The deaths confirmed her system. They didn't contradict it. This is the psychology of institutional evil, not insanity, but perfectly coherent rationalization of atrocity. But Mercy didn't operate in complete invisibility. Multiple people came close to understanding what was happening at Shepherd Flats. The tragedy is that none of them connected the dots. The first witness was James Whitaker, a supply trader who visited the compound quarterly to deliver flour, salt, medicines, and other necessities. Whitaker made his first delivery in spring 1884. His initial impression was unremarkable. An isolated orphanage, a woman of middle years, a handful of children who appeared subdued but fed. Standard frontier institutional conditions. But on his second visit, in July 1884, Whitaker noticed something odd. The children he'd seen 4 months earlier had been replaced. Some overlap, but not all. He asked Mercy about it. She answered without hesitation. Some children don't adapt to mountain life. Families or previous guardians have called for their return. The explanation was plausible. Orphanages routinely had flux. Children came, children left, children were transferred. Whitaker accepted it. But by his 5th visit, in October 1885, he couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. The The children from Spring had vanished. Different children occupied the compound, and all of them, regardless of who they were, shared a peculiar characteristic. They didn't engage. They didn't play. They didn't laugh. When Mercy wasn't watching, their eyes tracked toward the main building's cellar door with an expression Whitaker, even trying to convince himself it was imagination, recognized as fear. He asked Mercy directly if everything was well. She assured him it was. She showed him the children. She demonstrated that they were fed, clothed, and cared for. She allowed him to observe the sleeping quarters, a large room with multiple cots arranged in neat rows. Clean. Organized. Nothing obviously wrong. But Whitaker left troubled. He returned to the nearest settlement and mentioned his unease to the local magistrate. The magistrate was a man named Grant, who was nominally responsible for charitable institution oversight in his district. Grant had never visited the compound. Whitaker's concern prompted him to do so, in the spring of 1886. What Grant discovered during that visit was grounds for immediate investigation. The compound's visible quarters were spotless. Organized. Intentional. But when Grant asked to see the full grounds, Mercy became evasive. She suggested that not all areas of the facility were appropriate for external review. She cited the sensitive nature of working with traumatized children and implied that unrestricted access could damage the therapeutic environment. Grant, uncomfortable but lacking explicit legal authority to force his way into private spaces, accepted the explanation. He was a local magistrate overseeing a frontier region. Mercy was a woman with documented charitable credentials and correspondence from respected institutions. The law, as it existed in 1886, gave him no clear power to compel access to private institutional spaces. He filed a report noting that the orphanage appeared well managed despite minor irregularities in record-keeping. The report was filed, forgotten, never acted upon. Years passed. By 1894, a different witness emerged. A woman began receiving letters. The woman's name was lost to history, but her complaint was specific. Her nephew had been surrendered to Mercy's orphanage in 1890 and never removed. He was not returned when requested. His status became unclear. Communication ceased. The woman's inquiries reached Henry Aldrich, the newspaper editor in Springfield. Other similar inquiries reached him from different families. A man whose daughter had been placed there in 1892. A woman whose grandson had been sent there in 1891. The inquiries were sporadic, scattered, but consistent. Children seemed to enter the orphanage and then become invisible. Aldrich's journalistic instincts activated. He began correspondence with the institution, requesting information about the children supposedly under Mercy's care. Mercy's responses were vague, but never evasive. She said detailed records were maintained. She'd be happy to provide information about specific individuals. But privacy protocols, she insisted, required written requests from legal guardians. Aldrich applied pressure. He demanded documentation. He sent formal inquiries. And in October 1896, he announced in his newspaper that he intended to visit the facility personally to investigate conditions and locate missing children. Mercy's response to this potential investigation was swift. She read Aldrich's announcement. She understood that a newspaper editor from the state capital was coming to scrutinize her institution. She knew, in other words, that her time was ending. But instead of shutting down, instead of destroying evidence, she made a choice that reveals the depth of her pathology. She decided to acquire one more witness. She decided to keep Henry Aldrich. Before Aldrich walked through Mercy's door on October 18th, we need to meet the other people already imprisoned in that cellar. Because Aldrich's investigation wasn't about discovering an empty institution. It was about discovering an institution actively populated with children in chains. Thomas Briggs was the oldest, 16 years old. He'd been placed with Mercy's orphanage in 1889, when he was 9, by a county relief board in Kansas after his mother died. His father's whereabouts were unknown. No one had claimed him in 7 years. Thomas's early memories of the compound were relatively normal. Work, chores, gardening, maintenance. He was fed, though not abundantly. He was clothed. By the standards of frontier orphanages, he was being maintained. But as he matured, as he entered adolescence, the structure of the institution changed around him. He was moved to the second dormitory section, the one separated by the iron grate. He was kept separately from younger children. And he was introduced, gradually and through a manipulation so systematic it was documented in Mercy's journals, to the concept that his role at the institution involved spiritual service. By age 14, Thomas understood what that meant. The isolation and the drugged state prevented clear resistance. By age 16, he'd been paired with two different young females, one 14, one barely 13, in what Mercy documented as breeding experiments. When investigators freed him, Thomas was malnourished but physically intact. His psychological state was what investigators would later recognize as deliberately fractured. Mercy had used a combination of deprivation, substance manipulation, and a theology that framed abuse as spiritual purpose to create a child who'd internalized his own victimization. Margaret Sullivan was 13. She'd been placed with Mercy's orphanage in 1892, when her mother, a consumptive seamstress from St. Louis, had died and no other family claimed her. For the first 2 years at the compound, Margaret existed in what resembled normal orphanage conditions: chores, dormitory space, minimal education. But in 1894, when she reached 11, the institution's structure reconfigured around her. Her records, both in Mercy's journals and in Samuel Cross's biological ledger, show that she was introduced to her spiritual calling beginning in November 1894. The ledger documented her with clinical precision. Margaret's initial resistance, Mercy's notes referencing resistance requiring increased discipline, her reference to necessary supplementation of the calming tea to manage emotional dysregulation. This is the language of psychological grooming, recorded by the perpetrator herself, in real time, as it occurred. By the time of Aldrich's arrival, Margaret had been pregnant twice. One pregnancy had ended in miscarriage. The second had ended in live birth. A daughter delivered in August 1896 who lived for 3 days before dying, of what Mercy recorded as insufficient spiritual essence. Margaret was 13 years old. She had given birth while imprisoned and sedated. Her child was dead. And according to Mercy's records, this represented a natural failure of spiritual incompleteness. Margaret never spoke during the investigation. Investigators noted that she was present in the interview room, but functionally nonverbal. Modern trauma specialists would recognize her state as consistent with severe dissociation. James Mitchell was 8 years old when he was placed with the orphanage. He'd been found abandoned outside a church in Kansas City. The church had named him, as his original identity was unknown. He was now 9.5, the youngest child currently imprisoned at Shepherd Flats when investigators arrived. He'd been at the compound for 18 months. James's circumstances represent the mechanism by which Mercy's institution remained invisible. A child with no documented history, no known family, no previous institution tracking him. If James vanished, if he was exploited or killed, the liability fell on a church that had already moved past the case years earlier. But James wasn't being exploited. Not yet. Mercy's notes reference potential for spiritual development at age 12. He was being warehoused, systematically isolated from any external connection, kept compliant through light sedation, waiting for the moment when he would be old enough to become part of the breeding program. There were others. Mary Kelso, 14, Robert Nolan, 12, Sarah Hutchins, 11, David Monroe, 13, a girl referred to only as the one from St. Louis, 7 years old, another called the temporary resident, 10, 4 others whose names were never fully documented, children who'd been passed through the compound, exploited, and either moved to other locations or died in the darkness and were buried in the unmarked hollow behind the barn. What connected all of these children was singular. They were invisible to the outside world, orphaned, disconnected, without advocates, under the control of an institution, geographically isolated, and powerless to resist a system that had systematized their exploitation and wrapped it in the language of theology. This is why Mercy chose orphans specifically, not out of any commitment to charity, but because orphans were erasable. October 18, 1896. Henry Aldrich's carriage arrived at Shepherd Flats in the late afternoon. The isolation was immediately apparent. The compound sat in a hollow surrounded by dense timber. No neighboring settlements. No visible roads connecting to anything else. The kind of place where sound died and distance was measured in days of travel rather than hours. Mercy was waiting. She was polite, educated, articulate. She welcomed Aldrich into the compound's main building. She showed him the visible dormitory, clean, organized, children present and apparently fed. She showed him the kitchen, the administrative area. She was cooperative in a way that seemed designed to diffuse suspicion. But Aldrich had come to investigate, and he noticed what Grant had noticed 8 years earlier. The visible space didn't match the scale of the building. The floor plan suggested dormitory capacity for perhaps 30 people, but only a handful of children were visible. He asked Mercy to see the full premises, the cellar, the storage areas, everything. Mercy consented, perhaps believing that the visible areas would satisfy him, or perhaps because she'd already begun calculating the odds. An editor from Springfield was standing in her compound. He was demanding access. The end was near regardless. She might have already decided to accelerate her plans. When Aldrich asked about the cellar, noting that he could hear what sounded like chains from the floor above, Mercy's composure fractured. She said the cellar was sealed off. Structural concerns. Unsafe. She preferred he didn't go down there. Aldrich, already suspicious and now visibly alarmed, pressed. He was an editor from Springfield. He had authority. He intended to see every square inch of the property. This is when Mercy made her fatal error. She attempted to detain him. What happened over the next 73 days would only become clear after the intervention that followed. But the record suggests that Mercy, realizing her institution was about to be exposed, moved to silence the one person most likely to trigger investigation. She drugged Aldrich, using the same opium chloral mixture she used on the children. When he regained consciousness, he was in the isolation chamber. 6 feet square. No natural light, chained to the wall, fed on the same meager rations given to the children. October 25th, 1896. 1 week had passed. Aldrich had said he'd return in a week. If he didn't, his colleagues had instructions. Send for help. They sent for help. The Springfield authorities received the report of a missing newspaper editor. The Springfield authorities contacted the federal marshal. The federal marshal, understanding that a state official was missing in circumstances that suggested foul play, dispatched Deputy Marshal Thomas Finch to investigate. Finch was a careful investigator. His reputation in federal service was built on meticulous documentation in frontier cases where proper procedure often took a back seat to mob justice or institutional corruption. He knew that whatever he discovered at Shepherd Flats would require absolute evidentiary rigor to stand up in court. He arrived on November 3, 1896, with a warrant to investigate allegations of missing persons. Finch knew nothing of the cellar. He knew nothing of the children. He knew only that a newspaper editor had vanished at an isolated orphanage in the Ozarks. He knew that Mercy Caldwell was the last known contact. When Mercy opened the door, Finch saw immediately that something was wrong. The building's architecture didn't match its visible occupancy. The floor plan suggested dormitory space for perhaps 20 people, but only a handful of children were visible in the common areas. Finch asked to see the full premises. Mercy consented. He was shown the sleeping quarters. Clean, organized, intentional. He was shown the kitchen, the administrative area. Everything was exactly as Grant had seen it 8 years earlier. Correct on the surface, impossible underneath. But when Finch asked about the cellar, Mercy's composure fractured. For the second time in 2 weeks, someone had demanded to see the space she'd kept hidden. For the second time, she understood that resistance was futile. She told him the cellar was sealed off. Finch had his warrant. He didn't need her permission. The cellar door, when forced open, revealed a darkness so complete that Finch's lamp barely penetrated it. The temperature dropped precipitously as he descended. The space was subterranean, sealed, designed to maintain a cold that would weaken resistance and promote the sense of permanent separation from the external world. The initial chain sound resolved into visible chains anchored to limestone walls. 3 distinct sections materialized in the lamplight. The first section was a dormitory of sorts. Long chains anchored to the walls, creating small perimeters for sleeping. Children could lie down, but couldn't stand fully upright. The space was kept deliberately cold. The walls wept moisture year-round. The second section was separated by an iron grate. This was where older adolescents were kept separately but visible to one another. The chains here were different, shorter, configured specifically for movement designed for particular acts. The separation was both practical and psychological. It maintained arousal without allowing physical contact unless Mercy permitted it. The third section was the isolation chamber, a single cell, barely 6 feet square, where Mercy kept children who refused cooperation or showed resistance. That's where Henry Aldrich was found. Finch's lamp illuminated a man in advanced stages of deprivation, 41 days in darkness, on a diet of minimal food and contaminated water, chained, conscious but barely verbal. Aldrich had been systematically tortured, not through overt violence, but through the more insidious torture of imprisonment, sensory deprivation, and the psychological certainty that no one was coming to retrieve him. Mercy had attempted something even more disturbing. During moments when she'd entered the chamber, she'd spent time explaining her theology to Aldrich, speaking about spiritual essence, about divine breeding, about how his captivity was itself a spiritual experience. She'd apparently believed that if she could convince Aldrich of the righteousness of her cause, she could either release him as an ally, or, if necessary, eliminate him as a witness with less guilt. Finch ordered the children freed. He provided emergency medical care, and he arrested Mercy Caldwell, Felinda Morse, and Samuel Cross. When Henry Aldrich was brought to the federal marshal's office in Springfield and provided proper medical care, his testimony became the turning point. His account transformed what might have been dismissed as isolated institutional abuse into a federal crime requiring the highest levels of legal intervention. Aldrich was a man of standing, educated, respected. His account of what he'd witnessed and experienced at the compound was taken with absolute seriousness in a way that children's testimony, in that era, might not have been. Aldrich testified that when he'd expressed concern about accessing the cellar, Mercy had become visibly agitated. She'd insisted he leave. When he'd refused, she'd offered him tea. The tea had been drugged, but critically, Aldrich had experienced something the children hadn't. He had reclaimed his clarity. While imprisoned, Mercy had made the decision to allow him access to sections of her journals. She'd believed that by showing him her written theology, by allowing him to read her own justifications, she could convert him. She couldn't have made a worse strategic error. Aldrich had read Mercy's own words. He could testify not just to what he'd witnessed, but to what Mercy herself had recorded about her intentions. This evidentiary foundation, combined with the recovered journals, the biological ledger maintained by Samuel Cross, and the children's accounts, created a case so substantial that the federal prosecutor knew they could pursue charges extending far beyond false imprisonment. The trial of Mercy Caldwell, Felinda Morse, and Samuel Cross opened in Springfield Federal Court on January 15, 1897, before Judge Arthur Whitmore, a federal judge appointed by President Cleveland and known for his unwillingness to permit frontier customs to excuse documented crimes against vulnerable populations. The courtroom was packed. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco ran headlines about the Ozark breeding farm and the orphan imprisonment ring. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Calvin Morris, a federal prosecutor from St. Louis. Morris opened with Mercy's own journals, reading her words aloud to the courtroom. Mercy had documented everything: her theological rationale, her deliberate selection of vulnerable children, her procurement of substances to maintain compliance, her documentation of pregnancies, her complete absence of remorse, combined with her conviction that she was engaged in sacred work. The prosecution presented medical testimony from Dr. George Hartford, the federal medical examiner who documented physical evidence of sexual abuse on multiple children, signs of malnutrition consistent with deliberate deprivation, hereditary defects present in the deceased infants, consistent with genetic complications from consanguineous reproduction, physical and psychological markers of long-term confinement and systematic trauma. The defense attempted to portray Mercy as a misguided idealist. She genuinely believed in her theology. She'd never intentionally harmed anyone. The children were fed and sheltered, even if conditions were austere. Then Mercy took the stand. Under questioning, she was asked to explain her theology. Rather than expressing remorse or minimizing her actions, she doubled down. She spoke eloquently about spiritual essence, about divine breeding. She argued that the children, being orphaned and therefore spiritually incomplete, were benefiting from her program. When asked about the deaths of the 3 infants, Mercy responded, Those children were spiritually incomplete. Their deaths were not my doing. They were the result of insufficient essence in their biological ancestry. This is not murder. This is natural selection, as Darwin described. Judge Whitmore instructed the jury that Mercy's motivations were irrelevant to the question of whether her actions constituted crimes under federal law. Theology, personal conviction, philosophical framework, none of it mattered. What mattered was whether she had deliberately confined children, exploited them, caused harm, and attempted to conceal these actions. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts on all counts for Mercy Caldwell: kidnapping, false imprisonment, child abuse, sexual abuse of minors, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Felinda Morse was found guilty of aiding and abetting all counts. Samuel Cross was found guilty of sexual abuse and conspiracy. Mercy Caldwell was sentenced to life imprisonment. Felinda Morse received 30 years. Samuel Cross received 25 years. The Shepherd Flats case triggered a cascade of institutional reforms that would reshape how the federal government approached oversight of orphanages and child welfare facilities. Prior to 1897, child welfare was largely handled at the state and local level, with minimal federal oversight. The Caldwell case demonstrated that this approach was insufficient to protect vulnerable children in isolated areas. Within 18 months of Mercy's conviction, Congress passed the first federal child welfare legislation requiring regular federal inspections of any institution housing dependent children, mandatory reporting of suspicious deaths of children in institutional care, restrictions on geographic isolation of child welfare facilities, requirement for external guardianship, oversight of orphaned children, federal penalties for institutions that falsified records. The survivors were scattered across multiple states as they recovered. Thomas Briggs eventually worked his way into stable employment through federal assistance programs. Margaret Sullivan never fully recovered. She spent the remainder of her life in and out of psychiatric institutions. James Mitchell was placed with a relative and grew up to become a teacher dedicated to child welfare advocacy. Henry Aldrich returned to his work with renewed commitment. His articles about the Caldwell case and subsequent investigations influenced public opinion and contributed to the push for federal reform. Mercy Caldwell spent her final 23 years in federal prison, never expressing remorse, never renouncing her theology. When she died in 1920, her death went largely unnoticed. She was buried in the prison cemetery with only a number on her stone. The compound at Shepherd Flats was dismantled. The buildings were torn down. Today, nothing marks the location except a weathered historical marker that mentions only that a federal investigation concerning institutional practices occurred in the area in 1896. The marker doesn't name the children. It doesn't describe what happened. It reduces extraordinary horror to bureaucratic understatement. But what happened there, the systematic imprisonment and exploitation of 14 vulnerable children, didn't disappear. It shaped how America would protect its most vulnerable populations. Some of the survivors testified to their grandchildren. Some dedicated their lives to making sure it couldn't happen again. The institution was destroyed, but the theology that justified the crime didn't die with Mercy Caldwell. It remains, a dark strand in American intellectual history, intertwined with concepts of purity and biological destiny, and the right of the powerful to control the vulnerable. The orphans were freed. The perpetrators were convicted. But the deeper question remained then, and remains now. What institutional evil are we ignoring right now? What do we tell ourselves to justify not looking? Comment below. Subscribe, because the past isn't the only time we're this good at hiding.